Okay, welcome everyone to the Solana Validator educational workshop on Jito relayer setup. See what my mouse is? There we go. Agenda today. So I'm going to talk a bit about the Jito Solana as a whole. Luckily, we have people from Jito here, so if there's any more advanced technical questions that I can answer, we've got experts on the call as well. I'll talk a bit about what a Jito relayer is, why you should run your own, and then some tips on the setup. And of course, have time for questions after that, or whenever you have a question, feel free to ask. Okay, so a few things about Jito Solana. If you're unfamiliar or new to the space, just a quick overview. It's an MEV validator client built for Solana. There's another educational workshop that Lucas did from Jito that goes into a bit more detail about what Jito Solana is and all the different parts. So I'll put that in the chat in a bit. I don't have it handy right now, but if anyone does have it, feel free to post it there. The Jito Solana client is built on the Solana Labs Onza validator. It is a fork that is maintained alongside the Onza validator client. Some key concepts to know. So there's different components to the whole, I'd say, Jito ecosystem. There are searchers. So searchers are people that are interested in getting these MEV bundles, rewards, I should say, right? So searchers are looking for some sort of transaction ordering that they want for whatever purpose. And they do that through a concept called bundles. So a bundle is a set of sequential transactions that is run atomically, meaning it is either in one block or not in that block. A bundle cannot cross multiple blocks, and a bundle is also all or nothing. So if you have a set of 5 transactions in a bundle, if any one of them fail, then the bundle fails. So it provides some guarantees essentially about transaction ordering and transaction inclusion if it gets included into a block. So searchers create bundles for whatever reason, whatever purpose they want to create the bundle. I guess that's one important concept to understand. The other important concept from the validator's point of view is the relayer. So the relayer takes the space of the TPU, and the relayer's job is to take all the transactions coming into you if you're the leader, and then forward it to what's called the block engine. The block engine is where the searchers interact with the ecosystem, and they are essentially sending bundles to the block engine. The block engine then decides what goes back to the validator and gets included in the block. So all that talking, I think, is much better sort of exemplified in this diagram from, I think, from Lucas's talk last time. So you've got your validator here. This is mostly the Onza client with modifications from Jito Solana. You've got the relayer, which takes place of the traditional validator TPU and takes incoming transactions. And then the relayer sends those transactions to the block engine. The searcher decides what bundles they want based on the incoming transactions. Those bundles are then sent to the validator and ordered appropriately.
Can I chime in real quick, Tim? So yeah, I think unfortunately we need to update our docs since we've disabled the mempool. So right now sorry about that. I should have flagged it. But yeah, so right now the relayer to block engine, that connection still exists, but it's not being leveraged. And you can see that in the metrics on I think you'll get to the metrics page in a bit. And the block engine to searcher pathway is not being used right now. So yeah, right now it's basically the relayer is acting as the validator's TPU, and then it's basically kind of helping allow these auctions to take place in the block engine, where it receives a packet and then starts a 200 millisecond timer and forwards it, and that lets the block engine kind of simulate and gives searchers a chance to bid on these opportunities.
I guess conceptually, I don't quite understand that then. How does the relayer, how do the block engine and the relayer interact if the searcher is still talking to the block engine to get the MEV opportunities? How's it different,
Yeah.
essentially?
So yeah, right now the main use of the block engine is basically getting priority inclusion and getting included very fast. So we have basically there's some reserve compute in the blocks on Jito Solana for bundles, and people can send transactions through the block engine and land very fast. So I think there's some high frequency traders and market makers that are using bundles. I think they're landing like over 30% of their transactions in the same slot that they were sent.
I see.
So before they were kind of using the mempool as the trigger. Now the new trigger is the state updates, which are coming in over Geyser.
There's a question from Blake essentially asking, is there a blog post or information about the mempool shutdown and what it means? There's some disinformation floating around.
Yeah, can you stop our Discord and we can discuss it there? Happy to discuss there. I don't want to derail your conversation in the workshop too much on that.
Cool. Yeah,
thanks.
That works. Yeah, thanks for the clarification. I knew the mempool was shut down, but didn't quite get that it meant changes to this diagram, so that's helpful. Okay, so why run a relayer? A couple reasons, and I'm sure Lucas and others have more, but the main things I see are to improve decentralization, right? Currently, Jito runs all the infrastructure Jito runs public infrastructure for relayers, and there's only 4 relayers out there in the world. Fewer points of failure would be a good thing, right? If one big relayer goes down, that could mean problems for a lot of Jito operators. Of course, that falls back to the TPU that's already in your validator client, but still, if you want to make sure that your Jito MEV opportunities are always available, you should run your own and hopefully have more control over it. Another issue here is trust, right? You're making some implicit trust. You're implicitly trusting essentially Jito to run the infrastructure and not do anything for like personal gain, right? And I trust the Jito team personally, but of course, like running your own is always a more decentralized and better way to do it. And potentially performance improvements, right? With four relayers that have a lot of connections going to it, there may be some performance improvements there. I'll kind of kick it over to Lucas to see if he has any other thoughts or feedback there.
No, I think those are the main ones. I think, we kind of did it as a public good, and luckily we've had good success with the adoption of the client and starting to kind of outgrow the amount of load that they can take, and want to keep Solana decentralized. So I think it makes sense for validators to start running their own.
Cool. All right. Moving along. So there's 2 options I want to highlight from the docs. You can either run your relayer on your validator that's also running your stake node, or you can run your relayer on a separate machine. So sort of talking about the benefits of each. Running it on the single machine obviously is a bit simpler. You don't need external RPC access like you do in the multiple machine setup, and you don't have to monitor another node running somewhere. The relayer is a lighter process. I see people running with VMs with only a few vCPUs, so it's not a super heavy thing to run alongside your stake node. But I have seen some people say that they prefer a separate setup. On the external machine setup, it requires, like I mentioned, a separate machine and a bit of extra monitoring or monitoring of a separate node. It can potentially limit the impact the relayer has on performance, right? If there's a bug in the relayer where there's a memory leak or something spins the CPU, you're not going to impact your stake node. But it does require that you have access to a separate RPC server that is always up to the tip of the network. There's a environment variable that you can set where you can set multiple RPCs to access, but ultimately you're relying on an external thing to say that you're up to date with the chain instead of your own stake node. So up to you kind of what makes the most sense, but that's, I think, the trade-off between the two.
Yeah, I guess chiming in here real quick, I think the best setup is to run it on your same machine. The configuration for the external machine is a little trickier, and we've seen some like misconfigured relayers set up on external machines. Well, setting up on your local one is pretty simple and will result in the best performance.
Cool. Yeah, so there's a link here to the docs. I'll throw that in the chat. I'll probably reference the docs a bit, but wanted to talk a bit about the single machine setup. So the overview of the steps are, no step is too complicated, but there's a couple sort of places where you may run into pitfalls, so I just want to highlight them. First, you have to generate a public-private key pair using OpenSSL. And then additionally to that, you have to generate a key pair for the block engine authentication. And in order to be added to the block engine, Jito has to whitelist your key pair. So if you're currently running Jito and you want to run your own relayer now, make sure they whitelist your key before you start switching over to the new local relayer. Yeah, Brian just put the info for the Jito Discord. So if you want to whitelist your relayer, go to the Jito Discord. Next step would be to add the validator flags for your local RPC server on your stake node. So in order to run everything in one machine, you need to open up RPC locally. You do not have to open it up externally to the world, just locally so that the relayer can query for a few things in order to do what it needs to do. You need to add environment variables for metrics, for the block engine, and for gRPC IP address. Those are all in the docs I'll point to in a minute. And then, of course, you need to build and run the relayer as a separate process from your validator. Anything to add there, point out? Oh, cool. Okay, so these are the flags that you need for your, maybe I'll just go to the docs so it's a little clearer. Yeah, here we go. These are the flags that you need to add to your staked validator in order to have it work with your local relayer. The relayer URL should already be there, except it will likely be pointing to the public relayer. You want to switch it to your local relayer. You want to enable private RPC, which essentially says, I'm not going to make this RPC port available to the world. I'm just going to make it available locally. You want to make the full RPC API available. So by default, the RPC API is not the full set of API, the full API surface that you have access to in order to use the relayer. So this will give you access to all the, what's the word I'm looking for? All the API endpoints that you need. You want to specify the RPC ports. And then this last one, I think, may be a bit confusing. If you haven't run an RPC before, you're specifying the account index that you want to include in memory. These account indexes can be very large in memory, but this account index include key essentially says, I don't want the whole program ID account index. I only want the one that I care about for making my queries. In this case, which is address lookup table. So it's very important that if you include this account index program ID, you do not forget this one, right? Because theoretically, the setup works without this line, but then you're using much more memory than if you include both. One other question, Lucas or anybody else, this is actually a 1, right, in the program address?
Should be.
Yeah, okay.
Let me,
Just wanted to
let
verify
me
it.
look.
I saw it that way in a lot of different people copying and pasting, but just wanted to make sure. Yeah, so those are all the flags you have to add. Pretty straightforward. Again, this is your local relayer instance that you're going to run. And then the setup on the relayer side, here's a system config that should get you most of the way there. You're specifying the path to the PEM files that you generated and the new Solana key that you generated for the relayer. You're specifying a few environment variables. Make sure you specify the RPC bind address, the block engine URL, and then the metrics for Jito. This is the Jito metric server so that you can check that your relayer is up and running correctly after you started it up. And then the exec is pretty straightforward. Maybe one question that I've got here is I noticed you can specify a few command line arguments along with the allowed validators list. I wasn't sure if this is something that operators want to specify or not. Do you have thoughts there, Lucas?
Yeah, so if you bind your gRPC IP to localhost, then no one else will be able to connect.
Okay.
And yeah, if you bind to localhost, then that works. If you want to run it on a different machine, but you want to limit who can connect to it, then you can use allowed validators.
Okay, makes sense. And in this instance, you'd only want to allow yourself if you're, or any validator that you're operating, right? Is that correct?
Yeah, correct.
If you have an external machine.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool. All right, yeah, so I think that covers the setup. Again, I think the system config is pretty straightforward. Just make sure that you fill in all these environment variables. Next step is the verification. So a couple of things you can do to verify that your relayer is set up properly. You can grep the logs for relayer stage stats just to make sure that the relayer is up and running and doing something. You can also, and I think more importantly, look at the Jito Grafana to see that your relayer is up and running. I think in order for this to show up, you actually have to have some leader slots in your stake node. At least that's what I saw somewhere in the doc. So the leader slots are required before you actually get some data here. But once you get that, you can find your node in the list of, oh, sorry, I think this is maybe Jito, or sorry, Lucas, correct me if I'm wrong. This is a list of the pub keys for your relayer, not for your actual identity key. Correct. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so find whatever pub key you created for your relayer in this list, and then you should see that your metrics look similar to this, right? The relayer health should be 1, the validators connected should be 1, and the slot count should be going up. All right. That's all I've got for content. Any more thoughts or things to add, Lucas or anyone else?
Yeah, just feel free to stop by our Discord if you have any questions or comments. Someone asked about a log file, so there's GitHub issues, so you can feel free to add issues if you want a feature added. I think we should be working on adding the stake node override things pretty soon. So that's one thing that we're working on. And yeah, feel free to stop by Discord.
Yeah, Zentetsu, go ahead.
I don't want to spread any FUD here, but I think there are issues that people can have when they run their own relayer that we need to figure out and we need to make sure people aren't doing, because we have recently discovered, Tim pointed this out to me and I did some digging in. There are some validators running their own relayer that for one configuration reason or another are creating blocks that have very few numbers of transactions in them. And I'm not saying this is going to happen to anybody, and most people don't seem to have this problem. I don't have this problem, but we need to nail down what can cause this. So what I'm recommending is if you do start your own relayer, just watch your blocks for at least a while to make sure that watch your upcoming blocks, make sure that they look nice and full, and you have hundreds of user transactions in them, not just like a dozen or less or even zero. So just something to be aware of as we're trying to figure this out. I'd prefer people to recognize and see this problem and then seek out help than to not even know it's happening. And it's happened to, I don't know, maybe half a dozen that I've seen. And I think that Lucas or Brian can acknowledge, I think it's in some cases it had something to do with firewalling that wasn't set correctly. In at least one case I know of, it was somebody had a misconfiguration of some WebSocket port, and I don't know exactly how that caused it, but there are a couple things I think can cause this. And I'm only recommending that, I'm not saying people should not run their own relayer, because you absolutely should run your own. I'm just recommending that if you do start running your own relayer, that you just spend a little bit of time checking your blocks afterwards to make sure that they still look good. And if not, seek help.
Yeah, it's a good call out. There's a few like configuration things that we're working with on a few people. One is running a hardware firewall, and so we're trying to look through some of that. And then I think there's a few things in the relayer that we can do to make it potentially easier to detect misconfigurations. Or I think a lot of the misconfiguration issues are from running like a different RPC server or running on a different machine. So I think if you, that's why I recommend running on the same server, because there's less hops in between you and your validator and the RPC, and it's a little harder to mess up the configuration.
Cool. Any other questions, thoughts? All right. Great. Thank you, Lucas and Jito.